The other day you focused on getting gradients. Now it's time to move on to something a little bit harder. We're going to transition to drawing a form. The form I'm going to have you do is an egg, which is basically a sphere. When drawing the outline, make sure you have the 2B charcoal pencil in your hand, and also make sure that you're not putting too much pressure on your pencil point. So you want to go as light as you possibly can. That means holding the pencil a little bit farther back. You should get the outline of the egg shape and also the cast shadow. When you're starting a drawing, it's important to always do your darker values first. I also don't go as dark as I think I'll need to because it's way easier to go back and darken something than it is to try and erase or lift off some of that charcoal dust or material. Some artists will go ahead and draw the terminator line, that dividing line from the light side to the dark side, on their drawing, and then they'll shade over it or they'll erase it out later. You can do that, or you can do what I'm doing here, which is to go right into shading. And basically, what we're doing is gradients. So I'm starting out with a gradient for that form shadow. The form shadow is the shadow that's on the actual object itself. And remember, that form shadow isn't all one value. It's okay if it is initially, it's kind of a block in, but it's going to have a core shadow later. One thing that's very important when you're doing a drawing is to identify where the light is coming from. So I've put a little diagram up at the top to indicate the light source. What I'm trying to do now is just to get a generic base for my shadows. I'm looking at my form shadow and I'm comparing it to the cast shadow, and I ask myself which one's darker, which one is lighter. They can't both be the same value. They can be near it, but one has to be darker than the other. So either the form shadow is darker or it's the cast. When shading a cast shadow, it's important to go horizontally with your stroke. I do short strokes and I always think of the cast shadow as a gradient. It is usually the darkest directly beneath the form, so the egg, and then as it moves away, it's going to get lighter. And I'm looking for any shadows, so I'm not concerned with the light side yet. It's also not perfect in terms of each value. I'm missing some values, but I'm just trying to get the overall gist of the shadows. Now I'm going to go in and start to use my white pencil, and I am going primarily to the light side only, and I'm starting off with a little bit of pressure, but not going as bright as I know I can. Just like you're seeing on the shadow side, the light side also has gradients on it, and I am kind of curving my stroke to wrap around that egg shape, so it's a slight curve to indicate that this form has volume and it's bulging out. And then I also like to go back and forth between my 2B and my white pencil. At this point, I'm going to start to use a blending stump. And when you're using a blending stump, you really want to go in kind of tight circles. And you want to think about wrapping your stroke around the form, so kind of curving it with the direction of the egg. So I definitely want to mimic the texture of the eggshell, which is pretty smooth, but I'm not doing the blending just for that reason. I also want to make sure that my transitions between values is also a smooth shift. So I'm using this as kind of a base coat because I'd never just blend and then do nothing. What you're going to need to do next is layer on top of the blended material. So you're using that as kind of like an underdrawing, and then we're going to be hatching with the white pencil and the 2B pencil on top of that. By the way, I'm using mostly the white, the 2B, a little bit of the 4B, and I haven't used any of the 6B yet. 6B is really something that's reserved for your darkest values. So here's what it looks like at this point. I popped the highlight in, so I made that highlight spot really bright, so it's all the way to the right there. It should kind of fade into the egg. I like to think of a highlight as kind of like a melting pat of butter on a pancake, so it's like a big white spot, but it slowly fades out as it expands. Even though I'm not finished yet with the egg, I'm going to start to go to the background so that I get some environment to base the egg off of. For the background, you're going to treat it like a gradient. You can see I'm going one direction with my stroke. I'm going to make my gradient darker on the right side because my egg is lighter on that side and lighter on the left side. And then I went in with a paper towel to get it to blend and soften. And then I'm going to layer on top of that blended material. One thing I wanted to show you was a hatch mark because I like to put hatch marks in my background. I actually put it on top of blended material. So here's what a hatch mark looks like. You can go diagonal to the right or diagonal to the left, vertical or horizontal. I like to do this crazy erratic pattern where you switch it up. You do one direction, so I'm angling it, and then switch to a different direction and then a different one. It creates kind of like a wallpaper for the background and it can be interesting. You don't have to do that, but it is kind of nice to play with hatching and cross hatching. I absolutely love this technique when I look at a charcoal drawing or a pencil drawing and I see the artist has done some cross hatching. You can curve with your crosshatch, which is what I'm actually doing on the egg. I'm making a really short stroke. For my background, I shade and create like a mid-tone to dark value. Next, I blended the material with a paper towel to create a solid gray, and then on top of that, I did my weird, wacky cross-hatching. Cross-hatching isn't necessarily required, but I do love the look of hatching on a drawing. If a drawing looks too blended or too smooth, it can actually be kind of boring to look at. So I think marks can be exciting in a drawing. Here's an up close of patterning in the background. You can crosshatch one direction or you can do this method of changing it up every so often, and it creates kind of this visual pattern wallpaper behind your form. So there's still a lot to do on this drawing, but I'm going to pause it here so that you guys can get caught up and start your egg. Make sure again that you're drawing it the length of your index finger, that's your pointer finger, so that it's a correct length. You want it to be about the size or a little bit larger than life size, so an actual egg shaped. Make sure you're looking at your reference photo. I always clip mine on my board very close to where I'm working.